When working closely with clients, you start to notice that many of them experience similar challenges and ask similar important questions. This is a natural part of guiding people through a process, but manually typing out the same detailed answers takes away time from the bespoke work that you do best. Today, using Google Workspace Studio, you can route these common inquiries to an AI that references your specific company documentation to draft accurate, helpful responses. By using this automation, you're able to maintain a highly responsive, personalized inbox. So let me show you exactly how I built this in Google Workspace Studio. So the first and most important step in this is making sure that we've got the proper guardrails and the proper documentation to allow Gemini to provide the answers that are relevant to your business and not giving information to your clients that isn't accurate. So the first thing to do is create a folder with documentation that provides the right information to Gemini so it can answer those questions accurately. So you can see here we've got an artificial intelligence overview of some terminology and what is the process that you'd go through in the discovery process for a new client rollout. So that's the documentation that we've created. Then we jump into Workspace Studio. So you can access this by going to studio.workspace.google.com, and then you create a new Workspace Studio flow. So this flow is going to recognize when we get an email, and I've just set it to all emails here. But if you set it to specific emails, you can also narrow that down so it's from specific people, or the subject line might have certain words within it. But for now, we're just going to set it to all emails. Then what we want it to do is reference that document here. So does the email body itself have a question that relates to information in this document? So in this decision, this should be a binary yes or no. Does the email body that we're referencing have a question that relates to this knowledge article? If it does, great. It's true and it will go through the flow. If it's false, and if they're asking us something that isn't contained within this document, then it will come back false, and then it will give us another output. So if it's true, it will run this part of the flow and draft an email reply for us. If it's false, it will run another part of the flow and give us another output. So we've just got to make sure when we decide, we're very clear what the true and false is, and then give the flow all of the information to decide whether it's true or false or not. So if it decides it's true, they've asked us a question about terminology on artificial intelligence, then we know this is going to be true, and it'll go to Gemini to review the document and then come back with a response that aligns to our values, making sure it doesn't come back with jargon language, that it's friendly and approachable, and it's informative. And again, making sure that we're strictly adhering to that document for the responses, and we're not giving information over and above that document. Then what it will do, it will draft a reply to that email, but it won't send it. You can get Gemini to automatically respond, but I always want to review the outputs from Gemini before I click the send button, just to make sure it gives us all the information and it's in a form that I'm happy with. So I always set this to draft. There are other options if you want to just automate the full reply itself. So that's if it's true. It's recognized that there's a question that we can answer based on that document. However, if it suggests that the decision is false, so they've asked us something else, then it will come back to me and notify me in chat that someone has asked us a question via email that we can't answer based on that document or the documentation that you've decided to ground your automation in. It will notify me in that chat window, and it will say, James, you need to respond to this because we can't help the client based on the information that we've got in our documentation. So this is how the flow works. Next, we can run a test run with some emails that I've set up in the background, just as an example. So I'm going to click on test run here, and it will bring up this testing window. And what I want to do is reference an email that I've received. So I sent this to myself earlier on just as a test. So you can see here, the client, myself in this example, is asking, what is a large language model? And then we click on start, and it will run through the flow, and it will decide whether that question can be answered by the document that we're referencing or not. And if it does, it will say, yep, true, we can help with that. And it will help me to draft a response. So you can see here, it's come back, it's recognized that question is actually answered within that document itself, and then it can help us draft a response, which is great because that's exactly what we wanted to do. And then when I go to my inbox, I can see here that we've got the fully drafted email ready to send, and we can click send if we're happy with that, or we can do the edits before we send it back to make sure that it's giving all of the information and there's nothing missing, or there's a certain tone that we haven't quite captured before we send it back. So that's the one if it recognizes that someone has asked a question via email that we can answer based on that documentation that we've grounded it in. And now what we can look at is, what if they send us an email where the question isn't in the documentation itself, and we can use that guardrail to make sure that it doesn't draft an email, making up information or giving information that might not be accurate. So again, we'll click on test run down here, and we're going to change the email to be, can you help us with our business celebrations? So this is someone that asked us that we know that we've got a discovery process coming up, but we've also got a business that's turning 1 year old this year. Can you help us with a sponge cake recipe for that? So of course, that's not the sort of thing we'd like to reply to with a sponge cake recipe, but we'd like to acknowledge perhaps that the client is successfully turning 1 year old as an organization, and we look forward to working with them. So when we click on start, it will go through this flow, and it will demonstrate that this decision will be false because in the documentation that we've grounded it in, there isn't anything about a sponge cake itself. And instead of drafting an email reply, it's going to notify me in the chat that we might need to take a more personalized approach to this. So we can see here it's come back as false. And then when I go over to my Google chat window, it would have sent me a message in there to say, James, you need to respond to this email because it's not in the documentation that we've grounded in, but you do need to respond to this because they're a client that we want to work with in the future, and it might take a more personalized response. And this is just a way that you can set up an automation that goes through a decision to say, if this is true, we want to carry out X, Y, and Z actions, or if it's false, then we want to carry out a separate set of actions that also help us in responding to the client or whatever the flow relates to. Building an automation like this completely changes how you interact with your inbox. However, it's important to remember that setting this up is only the first step, and this has all been demonstrated in a controlled environment. Testing it is so important before you even think about rolling this out. As you use this system, you'll notice new questions your clients are asking, and you can continually update your grounding document with those new answers, making your AI assistant smarter and more capable every single week. And if this has helped you understand how to build more reliable workflows, subscribe for more weekly deep dives, and watch the other video that I'll link to up here that I have on how to automate meeting preparation in Workspace Studio. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.